They thought an orange notice and a $1,500 fine would break me. They thought they could burn my livelihood to the ground and dance in the ashes. But the HOA made one fatal mistake. They forgot who holds the deed to the water. I don't just live on the lake, I own the entire thing. And today, the fishing stops. Permanently. The mist over Silver Lake doesn't just hang there. It clings to the surface like a shroud. I grew up in the shadows of the Blue Ridge Mountains, where the water laps against the shore just 50 yards from my back porch. My father, Silas Vance, built this house with his own calloused hands back in 1974. He wasn't just a carpenter. He was a man who understood the value of soil and stone. My mother, Clara, taught at the local school, and together they carved a slice of heaven out of 30 acres of pristine Appalachian wilderness. But there was a detail buried in our deed, a relic from the original county settlement. We didn't just own the shore, we owned the lake bed. Every gallon of water, every bass, every inch of silt belonged to the Vance family. For decades, we lived in a peaceful silence that most people only dream of. The nearest neighbor was a ghost half a mile away, and we knew every soul within 5 miles by their first name. That silence died when I was 12. A developer from the city, a man with a suit too expensive for the mud, bought the tract next to us. Within 2 years, the heights at Silver Lake sprouted like a fungus. Dozens of McMansions filled with people who wanted the country experience without getting their boots dirty, and with them came the plague, the homeowners association. I remember the first visit. A man named Mr. Sterling arrived with a fruit basket and a smile that looked like it was painted on a cracked wall. He invited my father to join the association, promising tremendous benefits. My father, standing on his porch with his arms crossed, simply said, "We're happy as we are, neighbor." Sterling's smile didn't drop, it curdled. "You should know, Mr. Vance," he whispered. "Community standards are coming. You wouldn't want to be the one house that lowers the value." My father didn't blink. He just watched Sterling walk back to his shiny SUV. My mother tried to soften the blow, telling him our home was already exactly how we wanted it, but the seed of conflict had been sown. He knew then what I know now. The war for our home had just begun. Within months, the letters started arriving, not as invitations, but as attacks. They claimed our dock didn't meet their standards. They said our boathouse needed repainting. They even had the audacity to call our natural shoreline vegetation unsightly, demanding we replace the wild beauty with a manicured, chemical lawn. My dad would sit at the kitchen table, the yellow light of the lamp catching the gray in his beard, reading their notices while his face turned a dangerous shade of red. "This is ridiculous," he'd growl, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. "We don't belong to their group. They don't even have a say over our property." But the HOA didn't care about the law, they cared about the aesthetic. One evening, 2 board members showed up unannounced. I watched from the living room window as they gesticulated wildly, pointing at our yard as if it were a crime scene while my father stood his ground. When he came back inside, the air in the house felt heavy. "They're trying to strong-arm us," he told me. "They say our rustic look is bringing down their property values." My mother's eyes filled with a worry I'd never seen before. "Can they really force us, Silas?" "No," he assured her, but his grip on the table was tight. "Our property is not part of their development. They have absolutely no authority here." However, the pressure didn't stop. It became a siege. Letters arrived weekly. HOA members would accidentally wander onto our land, making snide comments about how we could improve things. Some even started using our lake without asking, claiming it was a community resource. By the time I was 15, the HOA had grown teeth. They elected a particularly aggressive president who began issuing us actual fines for violating rules we never agreed to follow. My father consulted a lawyer who confirmed we were right, and we sent a cease and desist letter. It bought us a few months of peace, but it only made them more creative in their cruelty. They started calling county inspectors with fabricated complaints. They reported noise violations when we had family over for dinner. Once, they even called animal control, claiming our golden retriever, Cooper, who wouldn't hurt a fly, was a dangerous beast. Through it all, my parents stood firm. "This land is ours," my dad would say, his voice a mantra of resistance. "We are not going to be bullied." I admired their strength, but I could see the cost. My mother's hair turned gray way too early, and my father's heart began to labor under the constant stress. When I left for college, the guilt gnawed at me. I called every night, and they always said they were fine, but I knew they were downplaying the war to protect me. I took a remote job after graduation just so I could move back, to be the shield they needed. But by the time I returned, the HOA had evolved. They had a new leader, Victoria Thorne, and she didn't just want us to join. She wanted us erased. The air at Silver Lake changed the day Victoria Thorne moved into the massive marble estate at the top of the ridge. She didn't just want a home, she wanted a kingdom. And my family's 30 acres of unrefined wilderness was the only thing standing in the way of her perfect view. When I returned home after graduation, I found my parents looking 10 years older than when I'd last seen them. The sparkle in my mother's eyes had been replaced by a constant, flickering anxiety. "She's different from Sterling Elias," my father whispered one night as we sat on the porch. "Sterling was a salesman, Victoria, she's a predator." He was right. Victoria Thorne didn't send polite suggestions. She sent directives. Within my first week back, a black SUV pulled into our gravel driveway. Victoria stepped out, clad in a white suit that looked blinding against the rustic backdrop of our woods. She didn't offer a fruit basket. She offered a solution. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice like silk over a razor blade, "I've reviewed the community master plan. Your property is a gaping hole in our aesthetic continuity. The HOA board has authorized me to offer you a generous buyout. You could retire to the coast. No more taxes, no more maintenance." My father didn't even look at her. He kept whittling a piece of cedar. "The land isn't for sale, Mrs. Thorne. It wasn't for sale 30 years ago, and it won't be 30 years from now." She didn't flinch, she just smiled, a cold, calculated expression that didn't reach her eyes. "Loyalty is expensive, Silas. I hope you can afford it." The very next day, the Silver Lake Fishing Club was born. Suddenly, the quiet mornings were shattered. Dozens of men in expensive gear began lining the shore directly across from our house. They didn't stay on the public side. They began drifting their boats within feet of our dock. When my father went out to tell them they were on private property, they laughed. "Victoria says the lake is a shared amenity," one shouted, casting a heavy lure that slammed against our boathouse with a sickening thud. "You don't own the water, old man. Get used to the company." I watched from the window as my father's shoulders slumped. He was a man of the woods, a man of quiet respect. He didn't know how to fight people who had no shame. I took over the patrols, walking the shoreline with Cooper. I'd find beer cans floating in the reeds, tangled fishing lines wrapped around my mother's lilies, and even human waste left in the tall grass. It wasn't just fishing, it was a psychological siege. They wanted to make our lives so miserable that we would beg them to buy us out. Victoria would often inspect the shoreline from her golf cart, watching the chaos with an air of satisfaction. Whenever I caught her eye, she'd just wave, a queen acknowledging a peasant. But she was making a catastrophic assumption. She assumed that because we lived simply, we were ignorant. She assumed that because we hadn't fought back legally yet, we couldn't. One afternoon, I caught a man named Miller, a local contractor who did all of Victoria's dirty work, trying to tie his pontoon boat to our private pier. "Untie that rope," I said, my voice steady but dangerous. Miller looked me up and down, sneering. "Or what, kid? You gonna call the HOA? Oh, wait. You're not a member. That means you don't have a seat at the table. We do whatever Victoria says, and she says this dock is a community hazard that needs testing." "This is private property, Miller. If you don't leave, I'm calling the sheriff." "Go ahead," he laughed, spitting a glob of tobacco juice into the pristine water. "The sheriff is Victoria's cousin. How do you think that's gonna go for you?" He wasn't lying. When the deputies did show up, they'd spend 20 minutes chatting with the fishermen and 30 seconds telling us it was a boundary dispute they couldn't settle. The law in this small county seemed to wear an HOA badge. As the months passed, the pressure intensified. They started targeting our income. My father had always sold a bit of timber and handmade furniture to keep the taxes paid. Suddenly, the county zoning board, at Victoria's request, denied our permits. They claimed our small workshop was an industrial eyesore in a residential zone. I saw the light go out in my father's eyes that winter. The stress was a physical weight on his chest. He would sit by the fireplace, staring at the deed he'd kept in a tin box for 50 years. "They're suffocating us, Elias," he whispered. "They're taking the air right out of our lungs." I took his hand. It was rough, scarred from years of honest work. "Let them try, Dad. They think they're playing a game of checkers. They don't realize we're playing for the whole board." But the darkest hour was yet to come. Because while Victoria Thorne was focused on the land, I was deep in the county archives, digging through records that predated the HOA, predated the state, and predated her arrogance. I was looking for the one thing that would turn her kingdom into a desert, and I found it. But before I could use it, the HOA decided to strike first, and this time they weren't sending letters, they were sending fire. The winter that followed was the coldest I can remember, not just because of the mountain frost, but because of the atmosphere in our home. Victoria Thorne's fishing club hadn't just invaded our water, they had invaded our peace of mind. Every morning before the sun even cleared the jagged peaks of the Blue Ridge, the sound of outboard motors would scream across the lake. They would park their boats so close to our dock that their shadows fell across our windows. My father, Silas, was a shadow of the man who had built this house. The vibrant, laughing carpenter was gone, replaced by a man who flinched every time a boat horn blared. He spent his days in his workshop, but he wasn't building anymore. He was just sitting, holding a chisel he no longer had the strength to use. "Elias," he said to me one evening, his voice thin like parchment. "They're starring. Even when I'm inside, I can feel them starring through the glass. They think they've already won." I looked out the window. Victoria Thorne was sitting on her marble balcony, a glass of wine in her hand, looking down at our rustic eyesore like she was waiting for a wound to finally bleed out. She had started a new tactic, the litter patrol. HOA members would walk the edge of our property, and if they found so much as a fallen branch or a cluster of autumn leaves, they would photograph it and send a public health violation to the county. It was 1,000 paper cuts, designed to drain us of every cent and every ounce of will. Then came the Saturday of the great tournament. Victoria had organized a community bass challenge. Dozens of boats launched from the HOA's makeshift ramp, but they didn't stay in the center of the lake. No, they swarmed our dock. They threw their lures into my mother's lily pads, tearing the delicate flowers to shreds. When my mother, Clara, went out to plead with them to be careful, one of the men, a man who worked for Victoria's husband, laughed and revved his engine, drenching her in a spray of oily lake water. She came inside shivering, not from the cold, but from the humiliation. My father didn't say a word. He just stood up, went to his room, and lay down. That was the night his heart finally gave out. The paramedics tried, their sirens echoing off the expensive houses of the heights, but the stress had done its work. Silas Vance was gone. At the funeral, I stood between the graves of my ancestors, the mountain wind biting at my face. I looked toward the back of the cemetery and saw them. Victoria Thorne and 3 members of the HOA board. They weren't there to mourn. They were there to scout the land. Victoria approached my mother, who was draped in black, leaning heavily on my arm. "Clara, dear," Victoria whispered, her breath smelling of expensive mint. "Such a tragedy, but now surely you see the wisdom in moving. A house this size, the maintenance. It killed Silas, don't let it kill you too. The offer is still on the table, for now." My mother didn't even look at her. She just gripped my hand so hard her knuckles turned white. "Get her away from me, Elias," she whispered. I stepped toward Victoria. I am taller than my father was, and in that moment the grief in my chest turned into something cold and hard, like the steel of a hatchet. "If you ever speak to my mother again," I said, my voice a low, dangerous rumble, "you'll find out exactly what kind of maintenance I'm capable of. Get off this lot. Now." She didn't look scared, she looked amused. Pride is a heavy burden, Elias. I hope you're strong enough to carry it alone. She was wrong. My mother didn't leave me alone for long. 18 months later, she passed away in her sleep. The doctor called it natural causes. I called it a broken heart. I stood at her funeral, the sole survivor of the Vance line, and I looked up at the white marble mansion on the hill. The HOA thought the war was over. They thought they were just waiting for the probate court to hand them the keys to the kingdom. They began treating my lake like their private playground, no longer even pretending to respect the boundaries. They held parties on the water until 3:00 a.m. They dumped their lawn chemicals into the reeds. They thought I was a grieving boy, broken by loss, ready to sign whatever paper they put in front of me. But as I sat in my father's quiet workshop, surrounded by the tools he'd left behind, I wasn't crying. I was reading. I had the original 19th century land grants spread out across the workbench. I had the county surveys, and I had a letter from the state's Environmental Protection Agency. Victoria Thorne thought she was the queen of the hill. She didn't realize that I was the master of the depths. The HOA had spent 30 years trying to take my land. Now I was going to take their peace. I picked up the phone and called a fencing company. Then, I called the most aggressive land rights attorney in the state of Virginia. "Mr. Henderson," I said when he answered, "my name is Elias Vance. I own Silver Lake, and I want to build a wall out of paper and steel." The game was no longer about survival. It was about retribution. After the funerals, the silence in the house was a heavy, suffocating shroud. I spent the first 6 months after my mother's passing in a fog of grief and grease, pouring my energy into the only things that felt real, the lake and my father's legacy. I quit my high-stress corporate job and officially launched Vance Lake Rentals. I used my savings to buy a fleet of top-tier kayaks, canoes, and high-performance fishing boats. I repaired the old dock and built a small, sturdy equipment shed near the water, using the same cedar joinery techniques my father had taught me. It was honest work. It felt like I was finally breathing life back into the land the HOA had tried to kill. But in the world of Victoria Thorne, my breath was a violation of her air. The HOA had spent years treating the lake as their own private country club. They had built a community boat ramp that dumped directly into my water. They held annual regattas. They even listed lake access as a primary selling point in their real estate brochures. They had forgotten, or perhaps they had never truly believed, that the water they looked at every morning didn't belong to the public. It belonged to Vance. I gave them 30 days of peace out of respect for my parents' memory. On day 31, the letters returned. But this time, they didn't come in the mail. I walked out of my back door on a Tuesday morning to find a neon orange notice taped directly to the door of my new rental shed. The adhesive was cheap, but the message was expensive. Notice of violation, Silver Lake Homeowners Association. Infraction, unauthorized commercial activity on community property. Fine, $1,500 per day. Remedy, remove all structures and vessels within 48 hours. I stared at the orange paper. The audacity was almost impressive. They were calling my land community property. I didn't tear it down, I left it there. I wanted the neighbors to see it. I wanted them to see exactly how the HOA operated. 48 hours later, the golf cart hummed up the drive. Victoria Thorne didn't even get out. She sat there in her designer sunglasses, flanked by Miller, her loyal bulldog, and the HOA's compliance officer. "I see you haven't cleared the clutter, Elias," Victoria said, her voice dripping with a fake, motherly concern that made my skin crawl. "I told you this property needs to be managed properly. You can't just run a business out of a residential eyesore. It's against the bylaws." I stepped off the porch, my boots crunching on the gravel. I didn't stop until I was standing right next to her cart. "Victoria, I've checked my deed. I've checked the county records. My house isn't in your association. My land isn't in your association. And this lake, it's definitely not your property." She let out a short, sharp laugh. "The lake is a shared resource, you arrogant boy. It's the heart of the heights." Do you really think a piece of paper from the 70s outweighs the current community standards? The fine has already doubled. $3,000, Elias, and we've already filed a lien against your house with the county. A lien? I asked, keeping my voice low. Standard procedure for non-compliance, Miller chimed in, stepping forward to show off his reflected badge. You can't sell, you can't refinance. We'll sit on this property until you're bankrupt, just like your father. The mention of my father sent a jolt of cold lightning through my veins. I looked at Miller, then back at Victoria. I could see the triumph in her eyes. She thought she had me trapped in the same cage of bureaucracy that had broken Sela's. I'm going to give you one chance, Victoria, I said, and for the first time her smile wavered. Take your orange stickers, take your fake fines, and get off my driveway. If you don't, I'm going to exercise my rights as a property owner, and I promise you, you won't like what that looks like. Is that a threat? Miller sneered, reaching for his phone. It's a legal reality, I replied. Victoria revved the electric motor of her cart. We'll see you in court, Elias, or more likely, we'll see you at the sheriff's auction when we seize this lot for the unpaid fines. Enjoy the view while you still have it. They drove off, laughing. That night I sat in my father's workshop and opened the tin box. I pulled out the 19th century land grant, signed in ink that had faded to a deep, dried blood brown. I looked at the survey map. The HOA thought they were fighting for community standards. They had no idea I was preparing to shut down the very thing that gave their community value. The war wasn't coming anymore, it was here, and the orange notice was just the first shot. The tension in the air at Silver Lake didn't just break, it ignited. After I stood my ground against Victoria and her orange notices, the harassment shifted from bureaucratic to personal. It started with small, cowardly acts. I'd wake up to find "Move Out" spray-painted on my gravel drive. My mailbox was smashed with a sledgehammer. Every time I stepped onto my porch, I could see the high-powered binoculars glinting from the balconies of the heights. They weren't just watching me, they were hunting for a weakness. But I wasn't the only one they were targeting. My business, Vance Lake Rentals, became the front line of their war. Victoria Thorne had used the HOA's private Facebook group to spin a narrative that I was a dangerous squatter, running an illegal, unpermitted commercial operation that would bring undesirables into their gated paradise. Suddenly, my rental signs were being ripped out of the ground. Customers who arrived for their kayak bookings were being intercepted at the community gate by Miller, who told them the lake was closed due to toxic algae or legal disputes. You're losing money, Elias, Miller sneered one afternoon as he blocked a young family's car with his oversized truck. Why keep fighting? Victoria's offer is the only way out before you lose everything. I looked at the young family, apologized for the neighborhood drama, and gave them a full refund. As they drove away, I turned to Miller. You think you're choking me out, Miller, but you're just tightening the noose around your own neck. I'm documenting every interference, every lie. Miller just laughed, a wet, grating sound. Documentation doesn't mean much when you don't have a roof over your head. That comment stayed with me. It felt like a prophecy. 3 nights later, the mountains were silent. A thick Appalachian fog had rolled in, swallowing the moon and turning the lake into a bowl of ink. Cooper, my father's old golden retriever, started packing the bedroom floor at 2:00 a.m. It wasn't his usual "I need to go out" whimper. It was a low, vibrating growl that came from deep in his chest. I sat up, my heart hammering against my ribs. Through the window, the fog wasn't white anymore. It was flickering with a sickly, pulsating orange. I sprinted to the back deck and my breath hitched. My rental shed, the one I had built with my father's tools, the one housing $15,000 of new kayaks and gear, was a towering inferno. The flames were licking the sky, roaring with a hunger that defied the damp night air. No, I screamed, grabbing the garden hose, but it was like spitting at a volcano. The heat was so intense it singed my eyebrows from 20 feet away. I could hear the fiberglass of the kayaks popping and hissing as they melted into toxic puddles. As I struggled with the hose, I caught a glimpse of something moving in the woods near the property line. A shadow, tall and broad, retreating toward the manicured lawns of the heights. I didn't chase him. I couldn't leave the house. If the wind shifted, the sparks would jump to the roof my father had built, and I would lose the last piece of him I had left. The fire department arrived 30 minutes later, but there was nothing left to save. The shed was a blackened skeleton. My livelihood was a pile of ash. The fire marshal stood with me as the sun began to peek over the ridge. He pointed a flashlight at the remains of the door frame. "Smell that, Elias." I leaned in. The scent was unmistakable, high-octane gasoline. "Arson," the marshal said, shaking his head. "Someone wanted you gone, and they wanted you gone bad." By 8:00 a.m., before the embers were even cold, Victoria Thorne's golf cart appeared at the top of the drive. She didn't even have the decency to look shocked. She looked satisfied. "Oh, Elias," she sighed, her voice dripping with that poisonous, fake sympathy. "I heard the sirens. What a devastating blow. First your parents and now this. Surely you see now that this land is cursed for you. The community is concerned about the safety risks your business brings. The board is meeting tonight to discuss an emergency injunction to have you vacated for public safety." I looked at the charred remains of my hard work. I looked at the smudge of soot on my hands. Then I looked Victoria Thorne dead in the eyes. I didn't yell. I didn't threaten. I just felt a cold, crystalline clarity. "You think this is the end, Victoria?" I whispered. "You think burning a shed makes you the owner of this water?" "I think you're broke, Elias, and broke men don't win against associations." She drove away, her laughter echoing off the mountain. But she forgot one thing. My father didn't just leave me a house and a lake. He left me a paper trail. I didn't call the police to report the shadow I saw. Not yet. Instead, I went into the house, sat at my computer, and sent an encrypted file to a contact I'd made in my tech days, a private investigator who specialized in forensic accounting. "Find out where Victoria Thorne gets her money," I told him, "and find out who Miller has been calling for the last 48 hours. The HOA had started a fire, but they had no idea that I was the one who knew how to burn their entire kingdom to the ground. The ashes of my rental shed were still warm when I walked into the law offices of Henderson and Associates. My eyes were bloodshot from the smoke, and my clothes smelled of gasoline and burnt fiberglass, but my hands were steady. I laid the tin box on Mr. Henderson's mahogany desk, the same box my father had guarded like a holy relic. "Is it ironclad, Arthur?" I asked, my voice a low rasp. Henderson, a man who had practiced land-use law in these mountains for 40 years, adjusted his spectacles. He carefully unfolded the parchment, his fingers tracing the wax seals and the elegant, faded calligraphy of the 19th century land grant. He compared it to the modern county plat maps I'd pulled from the archives. He looked up, a grim smile spreading across his face. "Elias, in my 40 years of practice, I've seen some unique deeds, but this is a sovereign kingdom. Your family doesn't just have riparian rights. You own the submerged land. Every grain of silt, every drop of water, and every fish that swims in it belongs to the Vance estate." He leaned back, the leather of his chair creaking in the silent office. "The HOA has been advertising this lake as a community amenity for 3 decades. They've built their property values on a lie. They have zero legal right to be on that water without your written consent." "I want the letters sent," I said. "Every homeowner in the Heights, every board member, and I want the signage ready by Monday." Monday morning arrived with a crisp, biting wind. While the residents of the Heights were sipping their morning coffee, looking out at their beautiful lake, a crew of workmen arrived at my property line. Under my direction, they began driving steel posts into the earth every 50 feet around the entire perimeter of the lake. Each post carried a heavy-duty reflective sign, "Private property. No trespassing. Water rights held by Vance Estate. Violators will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law." I didn't stop there. I hired a private security team, 2 off-duty deputies from the neighboring county, to patrol the water in a motorized skiff. Their instructions were simple. Anyone casting a line or launching a boat from HOA land was to be trespassed immediately. The explosion was instantaneous. My phone began to vibrate so violently it nearly danced off the kitchen table. The community Facebook group, which had been used to mock me just days ago, was now a hive of panicked bees. Who does he think he is? Our property values will plummet. Victoria told us the lake was ours. By noon, the Queen herself arrived. Victoria Thorne didn't come in a golf cart this time. She came in her Mercedes, screeching to a halt at the edge of my drive. She stepped out, her face a mask of purple fury. Miller was right behind her, looking confused and aggressive. "Elias, pull these signs down this instant," she shrieked, her voice cracking the morning air. "This is a public nuisance. You cannot block access to a community resource. I've already called the county attorney." I walked to the edge of the porch, leaning against the railing. I looked down at her, feeling a calm I hadn't felt since my father was alive. "The county attorney already has a copy of my deed, Victoria, along with a formal notice that the HOA has been illegally encroaching on private waters for 30 years. "You're delusional," Miller barked, stepping toward me. "We have a right to be here. The fishing club has a tournament scheduled for Saturday." "The tournament is canceled, Miller," I said, my voice dropping an octave. "And if you set foot on that dock again, I won't call the HOA. I'll have the security team hand you a criminal trespassing citation. And believe me, they aren't Victoria's cousins." Victoria's eyes narrowed into slits. "You think you're smart, Elias? You've just declared war on 100 wealthy homeowners. We will sue you into the Stone Age. We will take this lake through eminent domain if we have to." "Try it," I whispered. "But while you're busy with the lawyers, you might want to check the HOA's bank accounts. My private investigator found some very interesting discrepancies regarding those maintenance fees you've been collecting for a lake you don't even own." The blood drained from Victoria's face so fast I thought she might faint. She didn't say another word. She turned on her heel and got back into her car, her tires spitting gravel as she fled. The ace of spades was on the table. The HOA's power was built on the lake, and I had just drained it dry. But the real battle was only beginning. Because when you corner a predator like Victoria Thorne, she doesn't surrender. She gets desperate, and desperate people do dangerous things. The war had moved from the shoreline to the shadows. While my private security team held the line at the water's edge, I was submerged in a sea of data. My tech background and the forensic investigator I'd hired were peeling back the layers of the heights at Silver Lake like a rotten onion. And the smell? It was worse than I ever imagined. "Elias, you need to see this," my investigator, Marcus, said over an encrypted line. "I followed the money. Those lake maintenance fees the HOA has been charging for 10 years. They aren't going to a landscaping company. They're being funneled into a shell corporation called Thorne Heritage Holdings." "Victoria," I whispered, the name tasting like ash. "It's not just her," Marcus continued. "The HOA treasurer's brother is the registered agent. They've been skimming nearly 40% of the dues. They weren't just bullying you to protect their property values. They were bullying you because they needed your lake to keep the fraud alive. If the residents ever found out the HOA didn't actually own or control the lake, the amenity fees would stop. The whole house of cards would collapse." But the financial rot was only the beginning. Marcus sent over a secondary file, a log of cellular pings and text fragments recovered from a server backup. On the night of the fire, Miller had received a message from a burner phone registered to Victoria's business address. "The shed is the heart. Cut it out tonight and he'll have nothing left to bleed. Just make sure the wind is blowing away from the houses." My blood didn't boil this time. It turned to liquid nitrogen. They hadn't just harassed my parents, they had orchestrated an act of domestic terrorism against my home. I didn't take this to the local sheriff, not yet. I knew Victoria's family roots ran deep in the local precinct. Instead, I drove 3 hours to the state attorney's office and laid the evidence on the table. The day of the preliminary hearing for the HOA's injunction against me arrived. The courtroom was packed. Victoria sat in the front row, wearing a black dress and pearls, looking like a grieving widow instead of a corporate shark. Her lawyer, a high-priced suit from the city, stood up and began a theatrical speech about community harmony and how I was a rogue element holding a neighborhood hostage. "Your Honor," the lawyer droned, "the residents of the Heights have enjoyed this lake for 30 years. Mr. Vance's sudden claim of total ownership is not only disruptive, it's a threat to the stability of the entire county's real estate market." The judge, a stern woman named Miller, no relation to the arsonist, looked at my attorney, Mr. Henderson. "Does the defense have a response?" Henderson stood up slowly. He didn't look at the judge. He looked at Victoria. "Your Honor, we don't just have a response. We have a revelation. We move to dismiss this injunction immediately on the grounds that the plaintiffs have no standing. But more importantly, we have evidence that this lawsuit was filed to cover up a decade-long criminal conspiracy." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Victoria's lawyer tried to object, but Henderson was faster. He projected the deed from 1974 onto the courtroom screens. "The Vance family owns the water, that is a fact, but here," he switched the slide to a bank statement, "is where the HOA's dues have been going. And here," the screen shifted to the text message from the night of the fire, "is the proof of who ordered the destruction of my client's property." The silence that followed was deafening. You could hear the ticking of the clock on the back wall. Victoria Thorne stood up, her face a mask of jagged fury. "This is a lie. He's a hacker. He's fabricated these records." "Sit down, Mrs. Thorne," the judge barked. I looked at Victoria. I wanted her to see me. I wanted her to see the boy who watched his mother cry and his father wither away. I wanted her to know that her kingdom was currently being dismantled by the very man she thought was a rustic eyesore. The judge leaned forward, her eyes cold as mountain stone. "I am denying the injunction. Furthermore, I am ordering an immediate freeze on all HOA assets and referring this evidence to the state police. Mr. Vance, I suggest you stay close to your security. This court is adjourned." As I walked out of the courtroom, the neighbors who had once cheered for my eviction now backed away from Victoria as if she were a leper. Miller was waiting at the exit, his face pale, his hands shaking. He knew what was coming. Arson carries a heavy price in Virginia. I walked past them all out into the bright sunlight. The paper trail had led us to the truth. Now it was time for the final reckoning. The fallout from the courtroom wasn't a landslide. It was a tectonic shift that swallowed the very foundation of the Heights at Silver Lake. Within 48 hours of the hearing, state police cruisers were parked at the entrances of Victoria Thorne's estate and the homes of the HOA board members. They weren't there for a civil dispute this time. They were executing search warrants for financial records, hard drives, and the truth. The evidence Marcus and I had uncovered was the tip of an iceberg that ran deep into the dark waters of organized fraud. Victoria Thorne and the treasurer were arrested and led away in handcuffs in full view of the neighbors they had been robbing for years. Miller, facing a decade behind bars for first-degree arson, didn't hold out for long. He traded his silence for a plea deal, testifying in horrific detail about how Victoria had ordered him to burn the boy out, so the HOA could seize the land through a forced lien. The trial was short. The evidence of the $200,000 embezzlement through Thorne Heritage Holdings was irrefutable. Victoria Thorne was sentenced to 6 years in state prison for conspiracy, fraud, and solicitation of arson. Miller received 4 years for the fire. The Queen of the Heights traded her marble balcony for a 6x9 cell. But the real victory didn't happen in a courtroom. It happened on the water. With the board in prison and the HOA's bank accounts frozen for restitution, the residents held an emergency meeting in the community center. For the first time in my life, I was invited, not as a nuisance, but as a neighbor. I walked into that room, and the silence was absolute. These were people who had looked away while my parents were harassed. These were people who had fished on my dock without a word of thanks. "I'm not here to take your homes," I said, my voice echoing in the hall. I'm not even here to sue you, though my lawyer says I could. I'm here to tell you that the HOA is dead. The lies are over. From this day forward, the lake is mine, legally and officially, but I am not Victoria Thorne. The residents voted that night to dissolve the homeowners association permanently. They replaced it with a voluntary neighborhood association. No mandatory dues, no fines, no orange notices, just a group of people looking out for one another. I kept my promise. I reopened the lake, but on my terms. I created the Vance Conservation Pass. Any neighbor who wanted to fish or boat could do so for a small annual fee, money that goes directly into stocking the fish and cleaning the water. If you respect the land, you are welcome. If you bring the spirit of Victoria Thorne back to these shores, you are gone forever. A year has passed since the smoke cleared. The blackened patch of earth where my shed once stood is now a vibrant garden of wild Appalachian flowers, a tribute to my mother. I rebuilt the rental business, and it's thriving more than ever. But the most important change is inside the house. I finally renovated the kitchen, putting in the granite countertops and the double oven my mother had dreamed about for 20 years. I did the work myself, using my father's tools. I kept his workshop exactly as it was. The smell of cedar and old oil still lingers there. Sometimes, late at night, when the moon is full and the lake is a mirror of silver, I go in there and just sit in his chair. The weight on my chest is gone. The shadows have retreated. The HOA thought they could erase the Vance legacy. They thought they could buy, bully, or burn us off the map. They learned the hard way that some things aren't for sale. This water isn't just a resource or a property value. It's my blood. It's my history. And as long as I draw breath, it will remain exactly as my father intended, peaceful, private, and free. They tried to take everything. They ended up with nothing. If you've ever had to stand up to a bully, or if you think Victoria Thorne got exactly what she deserved, smash that like button. It helps the channel more than you know. And I want to hear from you. Would you ever buy a home in an HOA after hearing a story like this? Let me know in the comments. Subscribe for more tales of justice from the dark corners of the neighborhood. I'm the dramatic storyteller, and I'll see you in the next one.